So last Friday during the Gomchen Lamrim teachings, we talked about how not everything that is legal is necessarily ethical. So that's what has been on my mind, just the relationship between what's legal and what's ethical. And I think a couple of people were here for that teaching too. Yeah. And so, of course, I went to the dictionary first just to check up on the definitions of these terms. So, what is the law? It is a system of rules that a particular country or community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members and may enforce by the imposition of penalties. Yeah. So that's law. And then I looked up ethics, which are more broadly moral principles that govern a person's or group's behavior. And then when I think about Buddhist ethics, and we can discuss this later if we like, but for me anyway, very much Buddhist ethics is about non-harm, restraining ourselves from harming others and also harming ourselves. And we take into account harm or benefit in terms of a very long view, in terms of karma, in terms of multiple lifetimes. So we're not just thinking about what might be harmful or beneficial for me now, but I'm looking from a much bigger perspective. So when I was just thinking about these definitions, it just made clear to me that at least that the law is very much dependent on the social and cultural norms of a group. And the way I think about it, it's an institution created and enforced by ordinary sentient beings. So it can be influenced by afflictions and karma. So therefore, what is legal is not necessarily ethical. So that was just rolling that around in my mind. And what made this apparent to me was a video that I watched maybe 5 years ago when I was trying to figure out what that relationship was between what's legal, what's ethical. And it's a video produced by Human Rights Watch on ending child marriage in South Sudan. And already when you hear the title, it's a bit like, I had to tell myself, okay, we have to watch this to get educated on this issue, you know. And to my great surprise, when I started watching this video, it opened with a very reasonable-looking elderly African man talking to the camera, and he kind of looked like my grandfather. So I was quite surprised. I was expecting maybe, I see something sensational or difficult to watch, but really it was just this ordinary guy, and he was just talking about how in his village, everyone is a farmer, and the most important thing for a farmer is to have cows. Yeah, that determines your wealth, it determines your status, it determines your ability to work the fields. And if you marry your daughter off, you get a dowry of cows. So that's why it's really important to marry off your daughter. So he was just explaining the logic of why child marriage happens and why it is logical and necessary in their society. So for me, it was a surprise to see, maybe in my head I had expected to see monsters or some horrific crime. But here was this reasonable man telling us why it was important to his livelihood and why it was important to his community that girls are married off at the age of 12 or 13. So that was the opening of the video. Then next it cut to a young girl who had been married off against her will. She was maybe 15 or 16 by then. And it was very sad. She talked about how she had run away from home trying to get out of an arranged child marriage. And her father and brother found her, brought her back, and then kept her in a shed where they beat and tortured her. I think even electrocuted her until she agreed to go into the marriage with a man probably more than twice her age at the time. So it was very sad. And she just talked about how it had ruined her body to give birth at a young age. And also it closed down all educational opportunities and all her dreams. Right now she was in this loveless marriage, basically this house servant in another family. So that was the next interview. And then after that, it cut to a Human Rights Watch researcher talking about how important it is to introduce legislation to ban child marriage. And just watching the video, I thought, yeah, that's important, but who is going to police or enforce a law like that, right? Within knowing the setting of the community. Yeah, I mean, is a girl going to report her own father and brothers? Or do you want to wind up jailing all the men? How would it work, So of course it's important to have the legislative change, but I guess the video helped me to see it's so complex, and it was quite skillfully done because at the end, it ended with a image of the whole community at a mating ritual, I don't know what to call it, a community dance where the young men and women check each other out, and it just showed how it's just part of the culture to have arranged marriages, and yeah, that's what happens. And how you can change the law, but changing mindsets is a whole different thing, and it's a very long process. So that made me see how, in terms of our work as spiritual practitioners, yes, it's important to speak up for necessary legislative change. And I think there's also this much longer and more difficult work of changing minds, yeah, our own and that of others. Because as I was watching this video, I thought, wow, the real problem is ignorance, afflictions, and the 8 worldly concerns. Yeah, I'm really not very different from this headman. I totally get why you want some cows and a good reputation. And if I didn't take care of my own mind, I could be in that position one day. I could very well be the father who goes after their child to, comply or else. Yeah, you're not going to shame this family. I can see that in myself. So I think it's just made me think of how important it is to transform our own minds so that in the long term, we're able to help others to do the same. At least for me, it really hit home that why it's important to attain full awakening. Yeah, until our minds are completely purified and transformed, then we'll have the skillful means, wisdom, and compassion to benefit all beings. So, kind of a boring conclusion, but as you always, we need to do both. Yeah, to make our laws and policies ethical in this life, and also to keep working on our own liberation and awakening. And I was thinking about how in Nagarjuna's Precious Garland, that's a great example of how we try and make the two go hand in hand. Yeah, you have the Buddhist monk talking to a king, which is like a beautiful metaphor in a way for the dialogue between the law and ethics. Yeah. And I'm just going to end off with my 2 favorite verses from Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. And also this video, I watched this video on Human Rights Watch as an anagarika. I remember that. Just trying to figure out what does social action mean and what does it mean to benefit people. So here's Nagarjuna's advice to the king, verse 399. A dharma, in essence compassion, consisting of generosity, ethical conduct, and fortitude, was taught especially for householders. You should resolutely internalize it. However, if you are unable to rule in accord with dharma, because the world is opposed to dharma, then for the sake of dharma and glory, it makes sense for you to become a monastic.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that I totally see that all of the sides that you're bringing out in that story. And one thing that also speaks to me is the fact that without addressing the worldly needs of these populations, then change will be more difficult, because in their reality of everyday life, they need to survive, they need to eat, they need to have all of these things. And right now they are seeing their children, their daughters, as a way to get those needs met. Mm-hmm. And so even though legislation is definitely a step forward, it has to be followed by a way of addressing and meeting those needs that are not being met right now. Could be education. It could be some way of bringing a different livelihood for these communities. But it has to be a multi-pronged approach to ensure that these children don't continue to suffer these fates. So.
Yeah, that just reminds me of, I think, Jane Goodall's, one of her nonprofit projects. She started out going in to rescue gorillas in the forest. Then she realized, wait, the villagers are just as poor, and to help them to stop poaching, I have to help them with their livelihood too. And she wound up getting involved in all these development projects related to sustainable livelihood and water supply and healthcare for the village to save the gorillas. Yeah, so it was a nonprofit that took into account all the interdependence of so many factors, that it's not like you can go in and save one group and, it just has this huge chain effect on many parties.
Thank you, Venerable, for sharing this story and looking at it from a Dharma perspective. Yes, indeed. I believe oftentimes, too, in this country, we often look at other cultures or countries and may see their practices as barbaric. But at the same time, we have many issues here in our own country, and not just in our own country, but within ourselves, as you said. And it is only by starting with ourselves and our communities here, changing our mindsets and everything, before we can go help and change others in like another culture, and these other cultures too. When sometimes people see that, they feel a violent reaction, and some people may say, let's go invade and bomb this country, or do something like force them to change, which is not justified. So, like as you said, we must change ourselves first, and then we will be able to also help change others. To bodhicitta.